A few days after the Hungarian Grand Prix, the Central European country played host to the so-called Pan-European Picnic. The event was organised by the slightly unlikely figure of Otto von Habsburg, head of the famous family, and a man who, if history had unfolded differently 70 years earlier, might have been King of Hungary right now. A campaigner for European unity, he had suggested a picnic on the border with Austria to promote the idea of brotherhood of nations and so on, but the Hungarian government decided to use it to test the waters with Moscow and made sure that the word was spread around the East Germans camped around Lake Balaton that the border would be open at that spot for 3 hours. Several hundred of the refugees arrived at the border crossing between Sopron and the Austrian town of St. Margarethen and swept aside the old wooden gate, escaping into the west, while the Hungarian border guards watched them leave. After a tense few days awaiting censure, or worse, from the Soviets, Prime Minister Nemeth flew to Bonn and informed West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl that they would be opening the border with Austria permanently and would be making arrangements to convey all 100,000 or so East Germans in Hungary to the west, with the border fully opening by mid-September. And in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people linked arms to form an almost unbroken human chain on the 23rd of August to mark the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the USSR that had paved the way for the Soviet occupation of the Baltics, the carving off of Poland and ultimately World War II. The 690-kilometre chain, known as the Baltic Way or the Baltic Chain, linked the three capitals of Tallinn, Riga and Vilnius, and along its length was accompanied by the singing of traditional and patriotic songs, candlelight vigils, and the display of the pre-war flags of the three republics. While troops stood ready in Moscow to break up any sympathetic demonstrations, and the Soviet news agency TASS the next day blasted the so-called extremist national groups and their hysteria and terrorism, no attempt was actually made to break up the human chain, and the messaging from the Kremlin did a swift about-face and became much softer and more diplomatic almost straight away. Over in Colombia, open war broke out between the government in Bogotá and the various drug cartels that held power in the country. Anti-cartel presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán was assassinated, along with the judge, a police chief and others, and the government responded by rounding up 11,000 suspected drug traffickers. The cartels responded with a declaration of absolute and total war and began a campaign of bombing and arson. And in London, in the early hours of the 20th of August, the pleasure boat Marchioness, packed with 130 people enjoying a late-night birthday party, collided with a dredger and sank, killing 51 people. A tragic incident, but one which became a cause célèbre in the UK, as investigations went on for many years, with the government eventually having to open a full judicial inquiry, and it was not finally put to bed until 2001. As a result of the reports, among other things, 4 new lifeboat stations were opened along the River Thames in London. The attention of the Formula One teams, though, was on Belgium, where the annual visit to the scenic Ardennes looked like it was going to be a wet one, so perhaps it was just as well that the circuit owners had spent some $4 million adding more runoff areas, particularly the La Source hairpin. Local hero Thierry Boutsen had made his debut here back in 1983 and would this weekend mark his 100th start, but he had never scored points on home soil. Another man marking a milestone was Derek Warwick. Race day would be his 35th birthday and he was hoping for a present of some points. Berger, celebrating his 30th on the same day, would probably just settle for a finish. Lotus were all smiles after encouraging testing times, and Gugelmin and Capelli had both re-signed for March for 1990. Things looked rather gloomier over at Benetton, where Peter Collins had quit as team manager a few days after Hungary, and been replaced at least temporarily by his assistant Gordon Message. But if Benetton looked gloomy, a deep depression had settled over the Brabham team. New owner, Swiss businessman Joachim Lüthi, had been arrested back home in Switzerland over alleged massive fraud, and designer and team manager John Baldwin had left too. The team put out a press release assuring everyone that at the very least they were financed to the end of the year, but things didn't look good. With Jean Alesi off in Birmingham for the F3000 Super Prix, Ken Tyrrell was in need of a driver for the number 4 car and approached Benetton to see if Johnny Herbert was willing. They agreed, and Johnny, feeling he had to get his career back moving again as soon as possible, signed up for the rest of the season whenever Alesi wasn't available, although in Spa at least he'd still be wearing his Benetton overalls. Meanwhile, Volker Weidler had become the latest member of Real's staff to leave and was replaced by Pierre-Henri Raffanel, who would at least get a bit more of a lie-in on a Friday morning, even if he didn't have much more realistic chance of getting into the race. Replacing PHR at Coloni was Italian rookie Enrico Battaglia. Born in the Venetian town of Noale, home to the Aprilia motorbike concern, Battaglia raced karts as a young man before progressing directly into Formula 3 at the age of 21 in 1985. He came to the attention of the racing world in 1987 when he won the Italian F3 title with the Forti Corse squad. Formula 3000 beckoned for both team and driver, but both found it tougher going than they'd anticipated, and after posting 3 DNQs and a 19th place at the start of 1989, Enrico returned to Formula 3 and won the race at Monaco before Enzo Coloni called in August. His less than stellar track record didn't bode well for making the big step up, but you never knew. Pre-qualifying took place in damp grey conditions, with the Eurobrunn team reverting rather despairingly to the old car while the new one was worked on some more. As was quickly becoming normal, an Onyx was on top of the standings, with Johansson again a full second and a quarter ahead of everyone else, with Alboreto, Gasho and Alio taking up the PQ slots and leaving the Ozellas best of the rest, and Wojtek in the old Eurobrunn only saved from being slowest of all by new boy Battaglia failing to set a proper time at all. Spa isn't the most forgiving circuit for your first go at F1 after all. By the time qualifying proper began, the rain had set in and Berger went fastest of all to take provisional pole ahead of Senna, with Mansell third and Nakajima an encouraging 8th and Piquet 12th. But then Saturday dawned dry and the track was still dry when the second qualifying session happened, so it was back to the drawing board as everyone frantically reset their cars for dry conditions, and normal service was resumed on row 1, with Senna taking his 37th career pole and McLaren's 50th, by 6/10ths from Prost, with Berger third alongside Boutsen. Mansell was back in 6th behind Patrese, with Modena putting in a great lap to go 8th after being 27th in the wet. Warwick lined up 10th alongside Gugelmin, with Alio also doing really well in the Lola. The Onyxes, in their co-owner Jean-Pierre Van Rossum's home race, were 15th and 23rd. Herbert did well to put his Tyrrell 16th, 6 places ahead of his team leader Palmer. Both Ligiers were back on the grid after Hungary's double DNQ, but the major shock was that neither Nakajima nor Piquet had qualified, after the Japanese driver just couldn't find a balance in the dry, and the Brazilian had gone off passing a badly placed Guiar and didn't have time to set up the spare to his liking. It was the first time since 1982 that Piquet had failed to qualify, and the first time in the Lotus team's history that neither car had qualified. And, boycotts aside, the first time since 1970, when the team had withdrawn from the Italian Grand Prix after the death of Jochen Rindt, that there would be no Lotus in the race. Colin Chapman's daughter Hazel was there in the stands to watch, and Belgium was one of the biggest markets for Camel cigarettes in Europe, so the team's ebullient mood earlier in the weekend somewhat evaporated. Sunday morning was wet again, and Senna and Prost were now only 5th and 9th fastest, as all the teams were busy reverting to wet setups. The Pirelli runners, having seen their wet tyres prove completely ineffective in Friday's sessions, had resorted to getting the qualifying compounds and hand-cutting grooves in them, and just hoping they would get to the end of the race. Meanwhile, the pundits were contemplating the potential of a wet race to mix things up. Prost was known to hate racing in the rain, while Senna was an acknowledged rainmaster, but the McLarens had looked second best in the wet over the weekend, and Thierry Boutsen, winner in the Canadian rain, would hope the chips would fall his way once again. It would certainly be a very popular win if they did. By the time of the race it was absolutely sodden on track, with atmospheric conditions interfering with the quality of the broadcasting images to boot, and both Brabhams on their hand-cut slicks slithered off on the formation lap, so the start was held up for half an hour while some drainage grooves were cut in the track and the mud swept off where it had started to wash off the surrounding banks. Brabham had already got the spare ready for Brundle when Modena also went off, so Brundle's race car was dragged in, hastily repaired and renumbered, and Stefano would start from the pit lane. And finally they were all ready to go. The green lights came on, and away they went, Senna holding the lead with Prost behind as Mansell took to the grass to overtake both Williamses, and tuck in behind Berger in 4th as everyone else disappeared in the usual wall of spray as they streamed down towards Eau Rouge. With Senna the only man with a clear view, he rapidly pulled away from Prost, while further back Arnoux had a coming together with Alio, but both managed to continue, eventually in René's case. Berger was meanwhile as close to the back of Prost as anyone was willing to get in the conditions, as Arnaud and Alliot went for round 2, which saw the Ligier limp round to retire with deranged front suspension, while Alliot was left in the worst possible place and pushed on his way. Herbert's Tyrrell debut finished with an off-camera spin after 4 laps of the 44, and he climbed out and began to limp back to the pits on his still painful feet. Gachot was the next victim of the conditions, sliding off in the Onyx, but again being pushed back into the race by the obliging marshals, while Cheever actually enjoyed racing in the rain and had made his way up from 24th on the grid to 16th on lap 1, but his progress was halted by a loose wheel nut, which he came in to have seen to on lap 4. But somehow, despite the dreadful track conditions, there had only been those 2 retirements so far. Prost began attacking, setting the fastest lap on lap 5, with Berger still following, albeit a little further back and looking a bit ragged on the slippery surface. Boutsen and Patrese were holding station in 5th and 6th, despite having completely different setups. Thierry had gone for a full wet setup, but Ricciardo had everything set up for the dry except the tyres. Nannini was 7th and Warwick 8th, with Gugelmin 9th and Caffey 10th in the Dallara. By lap 10, somehow there had still only been 2 retirements, but that was soon doubled as Berger aquaplaned off at Raidillon while trying to lap Alliot, and Modena pulled in to give up after failing to get the balance right in his car. So Mansell had taken up the job of chasing Prost, with Boutsen now up to 4th, as Brundle also pulled in to compound Brabham's misery, and Caffey spun out from 9th. And all the time Senna was cruising calmly round in the lead, while everyone else seemed to be flailing around just trying to keep it pointing forwards. Piquet aquaplaned off from 10th, bounced right through the gravel and came to rest on the grass verge facing backwards, allowing him to motor round the gravel trap, pull a skid turn and get moving again. Johnny Herbert reached the pits and popped into the BBC commentary booth to say hello and told Murray about his brief race and the prevailing conditions.
Well, it was just basically I think I was just going a bit too quick. I was behind Stefan going into a rouge. There was lots of spray, and I couldn't really work it out totally, but basically it was my mistake, and I went a bit too quick, and I think I hit a white line, but it was my mistake.
Now, you have high-intensity rear lights. How close to the car in front do you have to be before you see that rear light as a danger signal?
I think you have to push your actual helmet against the light to actually see it.
Mansell was on a charge now, closing to within 2 seconds of Prost as Cheever pulled over to allow his old Renault team leader through, but Mansell got stuck behind Eddie and Michele Alboreto for a full lap before he found his way past, by which time the Williams twins were right up behind him too. Eddie was, quite unusually, shown the black and white flag, warning him he was being watched for unsportsmanlike behaviour for blocking Mansell. He would later, not unreasonably, claim that he hadn't seen the Ferrari behind because he was concentrating on looking where he was going. Boutsen was next past Cheever and Alboreto, but when Patrese tried to follow his teammate past the Lola, Michele moved over and contact was made, sending both off into the tyre wall. The two had an old rivalry, and one can only imagine the Italian vocabulary a bystander might have learned. That was the half-distance lap, with Senna leading Prost and Mansell, Boutsen 4th, Nannini now up to 5th and dealing with a fogging visor, and Warwick harassing him in 6th. Mansell was 18 seconds behind Prost, but set fastest lap as he put the hammer down and chased the Frenchman. Gachot went out for good this time, going straight on at Stavelot. It was Martin Brundle's turn to call on Murray Walker, while Mansell continued to charge, lapping some 4 seconds a lap quicker than Senna, pushing hard and setting fastest times just before bouncing across the grass at Les Combes, with Martin giving his expert analysis.
Just a bit of too late braking, Martin?
Yeah, obviously the track is beginning to dry, and you then have to find new limits for the braking area, and Nigel just left that one a little late. The car would slew sideways. We run a lot of rear brake balance in the wet conditions to stop locking the front wheels, and he chose to drive across the grass instead of spinning, and I think that's the right decision. We've all been across there at some stage. Yeah, as you can see, look, he's just let the back, in fact he turned in and the back started to go away, and he's now gone straight across the grass. But we all know that there's nothing in the middle there. Sometimes there's a few things that give you a puncture or take the bottom out of the car, but I would think he's pretty safe going across that part.
Actually, he was quite good at that. It certainly didn't look like the track was drying, as Martin said, but the rain had more or less stopped, and there were some wheel tracks starting to appear at points around the track. Apart from Mansell's charge, the race had become a bit processional, with Boutsen followed at a distance by Nannini, who was in turn being chased by Warwick, but none of them were making much impression on each other. The track did start to dry properly as the second half of the race wore on, and drivers began moving across to find wet patches to cool their tyres. By lap 33, three-quarter distance, the sun was even starting to peek through, though it was still raining on other parts of the track. With 9 laps to go on lap 35, Senna led Prost by 11.5 seconds, but Mansell was right up with Prost and started running wide at La Source, hoping to get a bit of extra momentum going down the hill, try and get a slingshot past Prost. It didn't work, but he was getting closer and was right on Prost's rear wing, and the race was starting to come alive as the laps ticked down. Mansell was clambering all over the back of the McLaren, which Prost was making as wide as possible. 5 laps to go, and the pair lapped 7th-placed Gugelmin, both now dodging off the rapidly drying track to cool their tyres, and such was the furious pace that they were rapidly closing on a cruising Senna. For lap after lap, Prost kept Mansell behind as Senna started his last lap, and Mansell knew it was now or never, giving it everything but in vain. Senna took the win, and Prost was second with Mansell third, and in the end less than 2 seconds covered the top 3. With Boutsen, Nannini and Warwick making up the points places, the top 6 hadn't actually changed since Patrese went off on lap 21. Gugelmin was 7th, Johansson salvaged something for Mr Van Rossum in 8th, and Eddie Cheever retired 1 lap short of being classified with the recurrence of that loose wheel nut. So a full house for McLaren. A front row lockout ran 1-2 from lights to flag and took the fastest lap to boot. By any standards it had been an impressive demonstration, and it gave Ayrton Senna his 19th career win, 5 short of the legendary Fangio, but more importantly for him, 1 short of his compatriot and rival Nelson Piquet. Prost's 6 points might yet turn out to be vital, as Senna cut the lead once more to 11, but he was running out of races if he was going to inch up on Prost 3 points at a time. On the other hand, that was Prost's 10th points finish of the year, and after 1 more, he was going to have to start discarding results, the rule that had denied him the 1988 title, despite scoring more points than Senna overall. And Mansell's fine run, with the Ferrari team having apparently solved the reliability problems on his car at least, meant that the Englishman was actually only now 12 points behind Senna. The next race would be Italy in 2 weeks' time, and Prost had said he would announce there his plans for 1990. Which didn't do anything to quell the rumours that he would be in a Ferrari. After all, where better than Monza to make that announcement?
Fantastic. Quick. It's a circus. Pressurized. Enthralling. Different.
Big business.
Exciting.
Awesome.
Bizarre.
Formula One, it's a jungle.